It was the kind of morning that wraps itself around your bones, gray skies, damp sidewalks, and a breeze that carried the weight of unspoken stories. Somewhere along the outskirts of Reno, Nevada, in a gas station that hadn't seen a renovation since the 90s, a moment was quietly waiting to change a man's life. No one knew it yet. Not the teenage cashier endlessly scrolling through her phone behind the plexiglass. Not the man pacing outside in worn-out sneakers and a faded green hoodie that had seen better years. And certainly not Elon Musk, who just turned off the interstate, not for any meeting or press appearance, but simply to fill up his car and grab a coffee he didn't really need. The man in the hoodie was named Jacob Renner, 39 years old, father to a 6-year-old daughter named Lila, who was waiting back home in their tiny one-bedroom apartment above a laundromat. He wasn't supposed to be here. He was supposed to be at a job interview across town, but the bus never came. Again. And the thought of calling to reschedule, of hearing that tired sigh from yet another receptionist with too many candidates and too few openings, it drained something inside him. So instead, Jacob walked for 2 hours and stopped here not to rest, but to gather himself to think. Maybe to pray, if he still remembered how. Meanwhile, Elon stepped out of the driver's seat, wearing jeans, a plain navy tee, and sunglasses that tried to mask how tired he really was. He wasn't traveling with assistants today. No camera crew, no security detail, just a quiet need to be on the road, somewhere between here and nowhere. He'd been thinking a lot lately about legacy, about connection, about what it meant to really help people outside of headlines and stockholder meetings. He wasn't looking for a moment. He just wanted air. And then their paths crossed. Jacob noticed him right away. Of course he did. You don't just walk past one of the most recognizable faces on Earth and not notice. But wasn't the fame that caught Jacob's breath? It was the absurd timing. The universe had a weird sense of humor. He had his resume folded in his back pocket, a single copy printed the night before at a library kiosk that jammed 3 times before spitting it out with a coffee stain on the corner. It was a long shot, an impossible shot. But then again, what did he have to lose? Elon walked past him, heading toward the store. Jacob hesitated, heart pounding. Should he say something? Should he leave the guy alone? What would it even mean to hand Elon Musk a resume at a gas station? But the voice of his daughter echoed in his head. Try, Daddy, even if it's scary. So he took a breath, stepped forward. Mr. Musk, he said, voice shaking just enough to betray his nerves. Sorry to bother you. I know this is weird, but would you mind taking a look at this? He pulled the resume from his pocket and held it out with both hands like an offering, like it weighed something more than paper. Elon stopped mid-step, sunglasses still on. He turned, glanced at the folded document, then looked at Jacob, not past him, not through him, but into him. A few seconds passed, then a few more, and Jacob braced himself for the inevitable polite smile, the awkward decline, the moment that would become just another story he'd never tell. But then Elon took the resume. He didn't say anything. Not yet. He just looked at it, and then at Jacob again. You got a pen? He asked. Jacob blinked. Yeah, actually. He pulled a cheap ballpoint from his hoodie pocket and handed it over. Elon uncapped it, scribbled something on the back of the page, and handed the resume back. Call that number in 2 hours. Ask for Nadine. Tell her I said you should. And with that, he walked into the store as casually as if he just asked for directions. Jacob stood frozen. He looked down. The writing on the back wasn't some assistant's number. It was a direct line, a personal extension, signed with a simple dash and an E. The paper trembled in his hand. He looked through the store window as Elon browsed the drink aisle, then turned to head back toward his car, as if nothing extraordinary had just happened. Inside the gas station, everything had changed. The hum of the coolers and the faint crackle of an old country song playing overhead gave the moment an odd sense of normalcy. Elon picked up a bottle of water, paid in cash, and offered a brief nod to the cashier who had no idea who he was. As he stepped back outside, the clouds above had shifted slightly, casting soft light across the parking lot like nature itself was pausing to observe. Jacob was still there, He hadn't moved much, except to glance down at the number scrawled on his resume at least 5 times. His hands had stopped shaking, but only barely. When he saw Elon emerge from the store, he straightened, trying not to seem overeager, trying to keep his expectations folded beneath the same fragile paper. "Thanks," he said quietly as Elon passed by again. Elon looked at him and paused, then gave a short nod, not just of acknowledgement, but of something unspoken. A recognition, maybe, of grit, of courage, of a man doing everything he could, even if it meant standing in a parking lot handing out hope in the form of a single page. Then Elon climbed back into his car and drove off. For a long moment, Jacob just stood there, watching the taillights disappear onto the road. The wind tugged lightly at the hem of his hoodie, as if encouraging him forward. He tucked the resume safely back into his pocket and glanced at his watch. 2 hours. 2 hours to wait. 2 hours to imagine everything that could go right or wrong. He started walking, not because he had somewhere to go, but because he needed to move, to breathe. The streets of Reno weren't glamorous, but they were familiar. He passed diners and motels, thrift stores and auto shops. He thought about Lila, her missing front tooth, her love of pancakes, the way she'd hug him like he was her whole world. He thought about how hard it had been since her mother passed 3 years ago. How every job he tried to land felt just out of reach, not because he wasn't good enough, but because sometimes the world just doesn't bend your way. But maybe today it would. He ended up at a park bench by a strip mall, sat down, and pulled out his phone. 11:47 a.m. 13 more minutes. He waited. The second the screen ticked over to 12 o'clock, he tapped the number. It rang once, twice. Then a woman picked up. "This is Nadine," she said, voice sharp but professional. Hi. My name's Jacob Renner. Hi. I met Mr. Musk this morning. He said I should call you." There was a pause, just long enough for Jacob's heart to start racing again. Then, "Oh, yes. I was told to expect your call. Hold on." Hold on? Hold on for what? He sat there, gripping the phone so tightly his fingers hurt. A few seconds later, Nadine returned. "Can you be in San Francisco by Friday? We'll cover travel. Mr. Musk said to get you in for a temporary position at the Hawthorne facility, logistics and operations. 30-day evaluation. Full pay. If it goes well, it could become permanent." Jacob didn't respond right away because he couldn't. His throat was tight, eyes burning. He cleared it twice before he could get the words out. "Yes. Yes, I can be there. Thank you. Thank you so much." She gave him a time, an address, and said someone would follow up with an email to confirm everything. The call ended. The phone went silent. Jacob just sat there, staring out at the parking lot in front of him. The world looked the same, but everything in it felt different. Not because of a job offer, not just because someone like Elon Musk had paused his day for him, but because, for the first time in a very long time, someone had seen him. Really seen him. Not as a statistic, not as a worn-down single dad with a wrinkled resume, but as a man with something to offer. And that changed everything. And hey, before we continue, can we ask you something? If you've made it this far, it probably means the story pulled you in at least a little. Maybe it reminded you of someone. Maybe it made you feel something. That matters. So if you want to follow along as the rest of this journey unfolds, and trust us, things are just getting started, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. But only if you want stories that don't just entertain, but connect. We're not about spammy gimmicks. Just real stories that stay with you. Now back to our story. Jacob didn't sleep much that night. Not for lack of trying. He lay in bed with Lila curled against his chest, her tiny frame breathing softly, her fingers wrapped around his thumb. But his mind was a whirlwind. Images kept flashing behind his eyes. Elon at the gas station, the number scrawled on the resume, Nadine's voice, 30-day evaluation. What if it didn't work out? What if he failed? And worst of all, what if he let her down? He looked over at the half-packed duffel bag sitting on the floor. Clothes, a shaving kit, a small photo of Lila, and her mom from before the cancer took her. Everything else would have to wait. He hadn't traveled in years. The idea of leaving Reno, even for a short while, felt like stepping off the edge of a familiar cliff. The next morning, he dropped Lila off at Mrs. Halbert's place, the sweet retired teacher who lived on the first floor and treated Lila like her own granddaughter. "We're gonna miss you, huh, Peanut?" she said, patting Lila's head as Jacob knelt to hug her goodbye. "Daddy's coming back soon, right?" Lila asked, her eyes wide. "Sooner than you can say spaghetti pancakes," Jacob said, grinning even though his chest ached. "Spaghetti pancakes," she giggled, and he kissed her forehead 3 times like always. Then he walked away quickly. Before she could see the tears, he wasn't ready to explain. The ride to San Francisco was a blur. Elon's team had sent a car, black, sleek, eerily silent. The driver didn't speak much, but he offered water and snacks, and Jacob stared out the window as dry Nevada gave way to the winding green hills of California. His phone buzzed every so often, emails, forms to sign digitally, hotel confirmation. It felt surreal, like he was watching someone else's life happen in real time. By the time they pulled up to the hotel, he was exhausted emotionally and physically. But he was also more alive than he'd felt in years. The next day, he stood outside the Hawthorne facility, badge clipped to his shirt, surrounded by people in business casual and lab coats. The place was enormous, modern, intimidating. But as he stepped inside and was greeted by a team member named Alex, something inside him clicked. "Jacob Renner?" Alex asked. "Yeah, that's me." "Welcome. Mr. Musk asked us to give you the full rundown. You'll be shadowing different departments for now: logistics, supply chain coordination, team operations. It's not glamorous work, but it's real and it matters. You good with that?" Jacob nodded. "I'm good with anything." And he meant it. The next week was a crash course in humility and hustle. He learned how to track components, how to file reports, how to communicate with warehouse techs, drivers, and supervisors. He made mistakes, plenty of them, but he also asked questions, stayed late, and owned up to every misstep with sincerity. He never tried to impress anyone. He just showed up, fully. By day 5, people started to remember his name. By day 7, they started inviting him to lunch. By day 10, he started smiling when he looked in the mirror. One afternoon, he stayed late to help a junior tech troubleshoot a routing problem. As they wrapped up, he noticed Elon in the distance, walking through the floor. No entourage, just observing. Jacob didn't expect him to stop, but Elon saw him, paused, and approached. "How's it going?" Elon asked, voice low but steady. Jacob wiped his hands on his jeans. "Good. Busy. Learning a lot." Elon nodded. "That's what I like to hear. Most people think success is about genius or luck, but it's really just about how much you're willing to grow." He started to walk away, then turned back. "By the way, your daughter, Lila, right?" Jacob blinked. "Yes. How did you?" "You mentioned her in your cover letter. That's why I flipped the paper over. Something about the way you talked about her, it stuck." And then he was gone again, swallowed by the hum of machines and murmurs. Jacob stood there stunned. It wasn't the compliment that hit him. It was the fact that Elon had read the letter, really read it, that he remembered her name. It made everything real. Not just the job, but the chance, the faith, the path forward. And for the first time in forever, Jacob didn't feel like a man trying to outrun failure. He felt like a man chasing something worth catching. By the end of the second week, Jacob had found a rhythm. It wasn't smooth or perfect, but it was honest. He woke up before sunrise, sipped hotel coffee that always tasted like cardboard, and walked the 12 blocks to the facility in the cool, early light of San Francisco. He liked those walks. They gave him space to think, to breathe, to remember who he was outside of survival. At work, he became the guy who stayed late to help others finish. The guy who double-checked the shipment logs and noticed when a barcode didn't match. He wasn't flashy. He wasn't fast, but he was solid. And in a world that often prized the loudest voice in the room, being solid started to matter more than he thought. One morning, as he stepped into the break room for a quick coffee refill, he saw a young woman with pink headphones sitting alone at the far end of the table, blinking rapidly at her screen. Her name was Malia. She'd shown him how to use the scheduling software on day 3 and hadn't spoken to him much since. He walked over carefully. "Everything all right?" She looked up, startled. "Oh, yeah. I mean, no, not really." Jacob waited. Let the silence open the door instead of forcing it. I sent the wrong routing file to the West Division," she said finally. "They already processed it. If they don't catch it before 2 p.m., they'll be shipping an entire week's worth of parts to the wrong state." "That sounds rough," Jacob said, then added gently, "Want help fixing it?" She blinked, surprised. "You know how to do that?" "No, but I can read instructions, and I'm a quick learner." She cracked the tiniest smile. "All right, let's fix it then." An hour later, the crisis had been mostly averted. Malia had made the correction and sent a follow-up to the team leads. She looked a little less like the world was ending. "Thanks," she said. Most people would have just ignored it or laughed. Jacob shrugged. "I've had enough things go wrong in my life. Figured it's nice when someone helps steer it right." That small exchange didn't change the world, but it changed something for her and for him, because it reminded Jacob that he wasn't just fixing systems. He was connecting, contributing, becoming part of something larger than the weight he carried. The following Monday, during a company-wide meeting in a glass-walled conference room, Elon walked in halfway through the logistics review. The presenter paused. Everyone turned. Elon motioned for them to continue and sat in the back, arms crossed, eyes scanning the room. Jacob tried to focus on the graphs on screen, but his pulse ticked upward. He wasn't presenting anything, but the very presence of Elon brought a gravity to the space that couldn't be ignored. Midway through the session, a senior manager named Roland pointed out the reduced margin of error on incoming shipments over the past 10 days. "We're not sure who to thank," Roland said, "but there's been a noticeable increase in double verification on inbound barcodes." Simple stuff, but effective. Jacob sat still, unsure if he should say anything. But Malia, seated beside him, leaned in and whispered, "That's you. They're talking about you." He didn't respond, just kept his eyes forward, heart pounding. After the meeting, as people filtered out, Elon remained seated. He called out casually, "Jacob, got a second?" Every head turned. Jacob nodded and walked over, feeling like he was floating above his own legs. Elon looked up at him, then gestured to the chair across. "You like it here?" he asked. Jacob hesitated. "Yes, I do. A lot more than I expected." "That's good," Elon said. "People who work with their hearts tend to surprise themselves." Then, after a brief pause, he added, "I'd like you to meet someone next week, Lisa Alcott from Team Integration. She handles long-term placements. No promises, but I think you've earned that conversation." Jacob opened his mouth to reply, but the words caught somewhere between disbelief and gratitude. "Thank you," he said finally. "I won't waste it." Elon gave him a simple nod. "I know." And just like that, he stood and walked out, leaving Jacob at the table with a heart that felt 2 sizes too big for his chest. That night, back in his hotel room, Jacob opened his laptop and started a video call. Mrs. Halbert answered, then turned the screen toward Lila, who was coloring at the kitchen table. "Hi, Bug," Jacob said, and Lila lit up. "Daddy, you look like a scientist." Jacob laughed. "Close enough. Did you build a rocket yet?" "Not yet, but I helped someone save one from getting lost." "That's almost as good." He watched her for a few more moments, soaking in the way her hair had gotten longer, the way she tilted her head when she smiled just like her mom used to. And he knew deep down that this wasn't just about getting back on his feet. It was about building a future where her feet could dance freely, without worry, without weight, without fear. Friday came sooner than expected. Jacob stood outside the meeting room, where he was supposed to meet Lisa Alcott, nervously smoothing down the collar of his only collared shirt. It was slightly wrinkled from his suitcase, but it was clean, and at least his shoes didn't squeak on the polished floors anymore. He took a breath, ran through the talking points he'd rehearsed the night before, then knocked. "Come in," a voice called. Lisa was already seated at the round table, a tablet in front of her, and a kind but unreadable expression on her face. She had the calm presence of someone who'd interviewed hundreds of candidates and had learned to read between their lines. "Jacob Renner," she said, standing to shake his hand. "I've heard some good things." Jacob smiled, but his hands were clammy. "Thank you. I've tried to be useful." "Useful goes a long way around here," she replied, gesturing for him to sit. "Let's talk about where you've been and where you want to go." It wasn't a traditional interview. She didn't fire off questions like bullets. She asked thoughtful things about the logistics system, how he managed communication between departments, what kind of teams he thrived in, what motivated him to show up early and stay late. And then she leaned in slightly and asked, "Why now, Jacob? Why is this the moment you're pushing so hard for something new?" He didn't need time to think. "My daughter," he said, "she's 6. She lost her mom 3 years ago. Since then, it's been just me. Every job I've taken since, it's been survival mode. This opportunity, it's the first time I felt like maybe I could build something with her future in mind, not just for it." Lisa's eyes softened. She made a few notes on her tablet, then set it aside. "You've got heart. We don't overlook that here. It doesn't always fit neatly on a resume, but it shows up in the work." She stood and extended her hand again. "We'll be in touch by Monday. But off the record, I think you're right where you're supposed to be." Jacob left the room feeling something strange, pride, unfiltered and whole. That weekend, he spent Saturday walking along Crissy Field, the air thick with salt and the distant murmur of the bay. He called Lila and told her about the seals he saw and how the fog made everything look like storybook. She giggled. "Can we go there when you come back?" "When we come back," he said, correcting her gently. "I want to show you all of it." Then, Sunday evening, as he sipped tea from a paper cup in a hotel lobby, his phone buzzed. A message from Lisa. "Jacob, we'd like to offer you a full-time position on the integration team. Benefits start immediately. Relocation support included if needed. Let's talk details tomorrow. Congratulations, Lisa." He stared at the screen for a long while, not moving, not blinking. Then slowly, as if afraid the moment might vanish if he moved too fast, he exhaled, set the phone down, closed his eyes. He remembered all the nights he cried quietly after Lila had fallen asleep, wondering how much longer they could keep the lights on. He remembered handing Elon that resume, not because he thought it would work, but because he couldn't afford not to try. And now, he picked up his phone, opened the camera, and took a photo of the email. Then he sent it to Mrs. Halbert with a simple message. "Tell Lila Daddy did it." The next morning, his new badge had his full name and department. He was no longer a temporary worker. He belonged. His first official task? Organizing the orientation kits for incoming employees, a small job, but one he took seriously. He remembered what it had felt like to be lost on day one. Now, he wanted others to feel welcomed, grounded, seen. In the weeks that followed, he made friends. Real ones. People who asked about Lila. People who saved him a seat in the lunchroom. People who didn't know his past, but respected his present. And then one afternoon, as he was reviewing inventory in the South Bay section, a familiar voice called out, still double-checking those barcodes. He turned. "Elon." Jacob smiled. "Old habits. Helps me sleep at night." Elon nodded approvingly. Consistency matters. Most people chase shiny things, but the ones who check the small details, they build empires. Jacob chuckled. "I'm not looking to build an empire, just a home." Elon studied him a moment, then said something Jacob never expected. "You know, I was raised by someone who didn't always get things right, but he never stopped trying, and it shaped me." There was a long pause. "I think Lila's lucky," Elon said. "She's got someone who shows up." And with that, he turned and left, disappearing into the facility once more. Jacob stood there, overwhelmed by a quiet kind of validation that didn't need headlines or applause. He was exactly where he needed to be. The following weeks flowed with a kind of steady momentum Jacob hadn't known in years. He developed a routine, structured, purposeful, reliable. The early mornings were still quiet, but not heavy anymore. He began to notice the small things, the barista who always added a cinnamon stick to his coffee without asking, the janitor who hummed the same old country tune as he mopped the lobby, the sun catching on the glass panels of the Hawthorne building like a warm nod from a universe itself. Jacob didn't just survive here, he belonged. One Thursday afternoon, as he returned from a run to the supply warehouse, he found a handwritten note waiting on his desk. It was folded carefully and tucked beneath his monitor. For simple words, "Come see me, Elon." No assistant, no printed memo, just ink and paper, straight to the point. He stared at it for a second, heart skipping a beat, then grabbed his badge and headed toward the upper floor, an area he rarely had reason to visit. The walk felt like an audition. Every step reminded him of how far he'd come, but also how much was still unknown. Elon's office was quiet. No one at the reception desk. The door was slightly ajar. Jacob knocked once. "Come in," came the familiar voice. Elon stood by the window, looking out over the city skyline, as if weighing something heavy against the backdrop of steel and sky. He turned when Jacob entered, gestured toward the seat in front of his desk, and took a moment before speaking. "You've been here just over a month," Elon began, "and I've had 3 department heads mention your name in the last week." Jacob blinked, surprised. "All good things, I hope." Elon cracked a rare smile. "If they weren't, you wouldn't be here." He sat, folded his hands on the desk. "I wanted to ask you something, not as a boss, but as a father." That caught Jacob off guard. "I've spent years building rockets, cars, neural interfaces, all of it, but I still struggle with the simplest human questions, like how to be present, especially for my kids. You seem to understand something I'm still figuring out. How do you stay grounded?" Jacob exhaled slowly, unsure how to answer that. Then he said, "I think you only learn to stay grounded after you've fallen flat enough times. When Lila's mom passed, I lost the part of me that knew what balance even looked like. But Lila kept showing up every morning with bedhead and cereal on her shirt, asking me to keep going. You don't stay grounded for yourself. You do it for the person who's watching you even when you think no one is." Elon nodded, silent for a long beat. "You know," he said finally, "people see me as a machine of ideas. But what they don't see is that I want connection just as much as innovation. Maybe more." He stood, walked over to a small table by the wall, and picked up a thin folder. "I've been funding a project. Quietly. It's aimed at building more equitable tech access in underserved schools. We're looking for someone who understands both systems and humanity. Someone who can manage teams, yes, but who leads with heart." He handed Jacob the folder. "I think that someone might be you." Jacob took it with both hands, heart pounding. Inside were outlines, names, even a potential relocation package. But what struck him most wasn't the opportunity itself. It was that Elon had seen him, not just his performance metrics. "I don't know what to say," Jacob murmured. Elon placed a hand on his shoulder. "Say yes if it feels right. Say no if it doesn't. Either way, I'm glad we met at that gas station." The words echoed like a full-circle chord struck on a piano. Jacob walked out of that office with the folder under one arm and 1,000 thoughts racing in his mind. He didn't know yet what choice he'd make, but he knew this. His life wasn't happening to him anymore. He was shaping it, one honest step at a time. That night, he video called Lila and told her about the new project. She was sitting in the kitchen with her drawing pad, surrounded by crayons and crackers. "Will it mean we move again?" she asked. "Maybe," Jacob said, "but I'd never say yes unless you were happy with it too." She thought for a second, then held up a picture she had drawn. It was of a rocket ship, crudely drawn, lopsided, but inside were 2 smiling stick figures. One tall, one small, holding hands. "I think I'm ready for an adventure," she said. Jacob smiled, eyes wet. "Then let's get ready to launch." Monday morning arrived with the kind of golden light that made even office buildings feel hopeful. Jacob stood just inside the facility's main entrance, folder in hand, waiting for the elevator to take him up to the newly assigned office where the educational tech project would be coordinated. He was still trying to wrap his head around the scope of it all. A few weeks ago, he'd been jobless and worried about groceries. Now he was stepping into a role that could bring actual change to students who, like his daughter, deserved more than broken systems and distant promises. The elevator dinged open, and he stepped inside, joined by a young woman with a coffee stain on her blouse who was muttering under her breath about Mondays. He smiled politely. She didn't notice. Upstairs, the room he walked into was bright and modern, filled with large touchscreens, stacked laptops, educational models, and a whiteboard already cluttered with flowcharts and scribbles about integration pipelines and deployment tiers. He felt immediately underdressed. And yet, for the first time in his life, he didn't feel less than. He was here for a reason. Jacob Renner, a voice called. A man in his 30s with a baseball cap and hoodie, clearly more startup than suit, strode over and extended a hand. Name's Keenan. I'm your lead engineer on this project. You're the one from the gas station, right? Jacob laughed. That's me. Infamous now, huh? Legend, Keenan said with a grin. Seriously though, everyone's been talking about the empathy layer you bring. It's exactly what we needed. Keenan showed him around, introducing him to the team, data analysts, software architects, project coordinators. They were a quirky, brilliant bunch, all caffeinated and fast-talking, but welcoming. One of them, a woman named Priya, asked Jacob directly what he hoped to bring to the project. I guess clarity, he said. There's a lot of genius in this room, but I think sometimes what kids need most is to be heard. If we can create tech that listens, really listens, we'll give them something the world keeps forgetting, a voice. The room fell quiet for a moment. Then Priya nodded, writing something in her notebook. The next few days moved fast. Jacob reviewed feedback from underfunded schools in rural towns, from teachers working 3 jobs, from parents who couldn't afford internet access at home. He sat in long strategy sessions and late-night brainstorms. He asked questions constantly about design, about impact, about ethics. He didn't have a technical background, but he knew people. He knew what it was like to have doors shut simply because no one had time to listen. One evening, after everyone else had packed up, he stayed late reviewing a draft proposal for a pilot school launch. It was ambitious, too ambitious, he thought. The tech was good, but the assumptions about the students felt sanitized. Like whoever wrote it had never walked a hallway where half the lockers were broken and the textbooks still listed Pluto as a planet. He grabbed a red marker and started annotating the document with notes. What happens when Wi-Fi goes out? Are we accounting for language barriers at home? Some kids won't tell us what they need. We need systems that can notice. He didn't finish until almost midnight. As he finally stood, stretching out his back, he saw someone standing quietly in the doorway. Elon, you're the only one here, Elon said softly. Jacob glanced at the time. Didn't mean to overstay. Just didn't feel right sending that out the way it was. Elon stepped into the room and picked up the marked-up draft. He scanned the red ink. After a minute, he looked up. This, he said, tapping the paper, is exactly why you're here. Most people edit for polish. You edited for people. He placed the pages back down, hands in his pockets. I built things to change the world, but sometimes I forget which world I'm changing. You remind me. Jacob didn't know what to say, so he said the only thing that felt real. Thanks for seeing me that day. Elon smiled faintly. No, thank you for handing me that resume. As Elon walked out, the lights dimming automatically behind him, Jacob sat back down. He looked at the red ink across the page, at the questions he'd scribbled, and realized something. He wasn't just helping build a platform. He was helping build a bridge. And on the other side of it, maybe thousands of kids who'd finally feel like the world was listening. The days that followed unfolded with a kind of quiet momentum, like the steady hum of an engine hitting its stride. Jacob had never worked on anything remotely this complex before, yet somehow he was becoming one of the voices people listened to in meetings. Not because he was loud or polished or technically fluent, but because he asked the kinds of questions most people were too busy or too comfortable to think about. How do we make sure this tool doesn't just teach, but learns from a student too? What does a quiet kid experience on this platform? Have we spoken to any teachers who don't have a tech background? His questions didn't slow the project, they sharpened it. And slowly, his presence began to shift the culture of the team. Engineers who had once seen metrics and machine learning began talking about empathy in the same breath as algorithms. Designers started running interface tests with real kids from diverse communities, not just private school beta groups. It wasn't revolution, but it was a shift. And it started with him. One Wednesday afternoon, a small group of middle school students from East Oakland were brought in for a hands-on session with the prototype. Jacob sat with them in the testing room, kneeling beside them as they explored the platform. He didn't observe like a supervisor. He sat like a dad at a science fair, curious, attentive, fully present. He noticed one boy, Khalil, who barely touched the screen. While the others raced ahead through modules and games, Khalil just sat there, his hands in his hoodie pocket, eyes darting between the screen and the exit sign. Jacob moved closer. "Hey man, not feeling it?" Khalil shrugged. "I don't get it. It's all numbers. I'm not good at numbers." Jacob nodded, glanced at the screen, then back at him. "Can I tell you a secret?" he said, lowering his voice a little. "I used to think the same thing. Still do sometimes." Khalil looked at him, surprised. "But you work here." "I do. But you know what I'm better at than numbers." "What?" "Listening, understanding people, figuring out what they need. And that's what makes this place work, people with different kinds of smart." Khalil sat up a little straighter. "You want to try one thing with me?" Jacob asked. "Just one?" The boy hesitated, then nodded. Together, they went through a storytelling module built to teach logic through narrative. Khalil lit up. He rewrote a story about a bike race into one about spaceships and dragons, solving a puzzle at the end that made him grin from ear to ear. Jacob clapped softly. "See? That's math too in disguise." Khalil's eyes widened. "For real?" "For real," Jacob said. Later that day, as the students were leaving, one of the teachers pulled Jacob aside. "That boy," she said, "he never talks in class. I've never seen him like that." Jacob smiled, heart full. Sometimes the right door just needs a different key. That night, he went back to the hotel with a rare sense of contentment. He sat on the bed, flipping through his notes from the day, but his mind was on Lila. She was the reason he noticed kids like Khalil. She was the mirror that kept him honest. He grabbed his phone and hit video call. She answered in a second, already mid-giggle. "Hi, Daddy. Guess what?" "What?" "I read 2 books today. One had a llama in a dress." Jacob laughed. "That's serious literature. Are you building something cool today?" "I think so," he said. "Something for kids like you." "Like meme?" "Or pretend me." "Real you," he smiled. She beamed. "Then make it fun, okay?" "I promise." And for the first time, Jacob didn't feel the guilt that had followed him since he'd taken this job. That lingering whisper that maybe he'd left her behind by coming here. He realized she wasn't behind at all. She was ahead, and he was clearing the path. By mid-October, the pilot program was approved. 5 schools across California, including the one in East Oakland where Khalil studied, would implement the platform. Jacob was assigned to lead the integration team, coordinating on-site support, training for teachers, and collecting live feedback from students and staff. It was overwhelming, but in the best possible way. The first time he stood in front of a classroom as a presenter, he couldn't help but flash back to high school, how he used to hide in the back row, avoiding eye contact, praying the teacher wouldn't call on him. Now he had the floor. Now people were looking to him, not through him. His voice cracked once during the intro, but he smiled through it. Honest nerves were better than false confidence. After the presentation, a teacher named Ms. Aranda approached him. "Your walk throughs are great," she said, "but what really landed with the kids was when you talk about your daughter. They need to know you're not just another tech guy." "I'm definitely not that," Jacob laughed. She glanced at her students, then back at him. "No, you're something better." At lunch, Khalil found him in the hallway, and handed him a crumpled piece of paper folded into a triangle. "What's this?" Jacob asked. "A mission," Khalil said with a smirk, then sprinted off. Jacob unfolded it. Inside, written in pencil and blocky letters, were the words, "Make school feel like home." Below that, a drawing of a rocket, just like Lila's. Jacob sat down on the nearest bench and held the paper like it was made of glass. There were moments that rewired your soul. This was one. He took a picture and sent it to Lila with the caption, "One of your space buddies left me a message." She replied seconds later, "Tell him I said hi and not to give up." Later that evening, Jacob stood on the sidewalk outside the school, the city's golden hour glow softening the edges of everything. He watched families gather their kids, backpacks bouncing, little shoes slapping pavement. He thought of how many of these parents had no idea what their kids were capable of, not because they didn't care, but because they'd been too busy trying to survive to ask different questions. He thought of himself, not long ago, on that sidewalk near the gas station, hands shaking, hoping a stranger would see more than just his circumstance. And now, here he was, being the person who saw others the way he needed to be seen. Back at the office the next day, the team reviewed data from the pilot schools. Engagement had doubled. Teachers reported a measurable decrease in behavioral disruptions. Students, especially those typically labeled as disengaged, were completing modules at higher than expected rates. But what mattered most to Jacob weren't the graphs. It was the hand-drawn "thank you" notes taped around the whiteboard. The sticky notes with smiley faces from the feedback wall. The messages like, "I like learning this way," and "Can I do more tomorrow?" During the debrief meeting, Keenan raised a glass of sparkling water and said, "To Jacob, whose questions made us better builders." Everyone joined in. Jacob smiled, modest and red-faced, but full. Later that night, he called Lila and asked her what she thought about moving down to the Bay Area. She paused for a second. "Will I get to visit your work?" "Absolutely." "Will we still have pancakes Saturdays?" Jacob grinned. "That's non-negotiable." "Okay," she said, "but only if I get my own rocket sketch pad." Done. They laughed together, the kind of laugh that carries history and hope all at once. That night, as he lay in bed, Jacob thought about how strange life could be. A gas station, a folded resume, a tired man on the edge of giving up. And now this. Not just a new job, not just a project, but a new orbit. One where people mattered. One where love, quiet as it might be, drove everything. It was a cool Saturday morning when Jacob and Lila stepped out of their new apartment in Oakland. The place was small but bright, with tall windows that let in streams of golden light and a kitchen just big enough for their famous pancake Saturdays. They had moved in 2 days ago, and there were still unopened boxes in the corners, but to Lila, it was already home. Her laughter echoed off the fresh-painted walls as she twirled barefoot on the hardwood floor, singing something about space waffles and unicorn tea. Jacob tightened the strap on his backpack and took her hand. Today was the community launch event for the educational platform, a small affair at one of the pilot schools with teachers, students, families, and Elon himself invited. It wasn't just about unveiling the final product. It was a celebration of people, of resilience, of futures rewritten from ordinary pages. They arrived at the school to find rows of folding chairs, balloons tied to the railings, and kids running around with paper rockets and science kits in hand. It felt less like a tech demo and more like a county fair run by engineers and dreamers. Keenan spotted them and waved them over. "Jacob, and this must be Lila." Lila stepped behind Jacob's legs shyly, peeking out. "She's just casing the scene," Jacob smiled. "She warms up after pancakes." "Well," Keenan said, crouching to her level, "we've got rocket stickers and orange juice. That's a decent start, right?" Lila nodded, just barely, and Keenan handed her a sticker sheet before heading off to manage the AV setup. As people filtered into the chairs, Jacob found himself scanning the crowd. Faces of kids he'd met over the past few months, parents who had cried during feedback sessions, teachers who had stayed after hours just to be heard. All of them here. all of them part of the story now. The event kicked off with a short video showing the journey, the design process, the field testing, the unexpected connections. Jacob appeared briefly in one of the clips, kneeling beside Khalil, listening, laughing. When the screen faded to black, people clapped not with polite formality, but with real energy, real belief. Then Elon stepped onto the small stage. He didn't have a script. He rarely did. "I've launched rockets," he began, "but nothing lifts off unless there's a launch pad. And sometimes launch pads aren't steel and concrete, they're people." He turned toward Jacob, seated in the front row beside Lila. "I met someone who reminded me that some of the most powerful minds in the world are carrying burdens no one sees. And that if we can build systems that listen, really listen, we won't just teach, we'll transform." The applause that followed wasn't explosive, but it was warm, human. After the speeches, people milled about, testing the platform on tablets set up around the courtyard. Kids swiped and tapped and laughed. Parents asked questions. Teachers made notes. Jacob wandered to one of the tables where Khalil was showing another kid how to customize a lesson avatar. "You've got skills," Jacob said. Khalil grinned. "I'm thinking of being a teacher. Or an inventor. Maybe both." "You'd be good at both." Just then, Lila tugged on Jacob's sleeve. "Daddy, can I show you my spaceship story?" She held up a tablet, eyes bright. Jacob bent down, arms around her shoulders, as she tapped through the story she'd written, filled with planets and solar dogs and starlight pancakes. "It's beautiful," he whispered. "Just like you." A quiet moment passed. Then Lila turned to him and asked, "Do you think Mama would have liked it?" Jacob swallowed the lump in his throat. "She would have loved it, Bug. And she would have been proud of you. Just like I am." She leaned her head against his shoulder, and for a moment, the noise of the courtyard faded, and the world shrank to just them. The sun dipped lower as the event came to a close. People began gathering their things, exchanging goodbyes, promising to stay in touch. Jacob looked around, taking it all in, the balloons, the chalk drawings on the pavement, the way kids hugged their teachers, the way hope moved quietly through crowds like music you didn't realize was playing until you started to hum along. He walked over to Elon, who was speaking with a small group of educators. "Thank you," Jacob said simply, "for all of this." Elon looked at him and nodded. "I didn't give you this. You earned it. You built it. I just noticed." They shook hands, not as employer and employee, but as people who had, in different ways, found purpose at a roadside intersection no GPS could have predicted. And as Jacob and Lila walked home, her hand swinging in his, he felt it again, that quiet certainty, that this finally was the start of something beautiful. Monday brought a quiet shift in the air. The launch celebration was behind them now, and what lay ahead was the real work, refining, expanding, ensuring that what they built could actually live up to the hope it had stirred. Jacob arrived at the office early, as usual, a fresh coffee in one hand and Khalil's notes still folded in his wallet like compass. He stood for a moment outside the glass door to the integration lab, just looking in. His reflection stared back, layered over white boards, glowing monitors, and rows of devices running live code. He smiled to himself. Inside, Priya and Keenan were already discussing adjustments for the next rollout. One school had reported a bug with login accessibility, another had flagged an issue with inconsistent translations in the Spanish language modules. But no one was discouraged. There was a shared sense of momentum. Like they weren't just chasing deadlines, they were chasing meaning. Around noon, Lisa Olcott stopped by his desk. She had a soft smile and sparkle in her eye. "You got a minute?" "Of course." They walked together down a quieter hallway, one lined with framed mission statements and archival photos from some of Elon's earliest ventures. Lisa led him into a small meeting room and closed the door behind her. "There's a new opportunity," she said. "It's not official yet, but it's coming. Elon's thinking global, bringing this platform to underserved communities internationally. But we need someone who understands how to make tech adapt, not just scale. Someone who sees people first." Jacob listened, heart rate ticking upward. Would I be traveling, he asked. Yes, some, not all the time, but you'd be working with teams in different countries, helping them shape their own tools using the core framework. It's less command and control, more partnership. He nodded slowly. And Lila? Lisa smiled again. We'd structure it so you never miss what matters. Remote first, flexible hours. You'd still be based here. But Jacob, this is leadership. You've earned it. He sat there a long moment after she left, running his fingers along the edge of the table. Leadership. That word had always belonged to other people, people with degrees, with polished shoes, with corporate gloss. But now it felt different. Now it felt like a mantle he could wear without losing who he was. That night, after dinner, he and Lila went for a walk. They strolled through their new neighborhood, past rows of quirky houses with string lights on balconies and community gardens blooming between apartment complexes. She skipped ahead, collecting leaves, naming them like old friends. "Daddy," she called suddenly, "do you think stars get tired?" He blinked, caught off guard. Tired of what? Of shining all the time. He thought for a moment. Maybe, but maybe it's not work for them. Maybe it's just what they do, because the sky needs them. She considered that, then nodded solemnly, as if she understood something he didn't. They reached a mural painted along a brick wall, an astronaut holding hands with a child as they floated through space, connected by a thread of light. Lila stopped and stared. "That's us," she said. "Only you don't need a suit. You're strong enough without it." Jacob's throat tightened. He crouched down and pulled her close. "I'm only strong because I have you." Later that night, after she had fallen asleep clutching her sketchpad, he opened his laptop and wrote the first email to the global strategy team. It wasn't filled with jargon, just clarity, compassion, commitment. He ended it with a line that had become his personal mission. Technology can teach, but empathy builds trust, and trust changes lives. He hit send. The cursor blinked on the screen, silent and full of promise. Jacob looked out the window at the quiet city below. No headlines, no spotlight, just another man trying to build something good. And somewhere across town, Elon read that same email and smiled. Because he knew this, not stock prices or launch trajectories, this was the future he wanted to be part of. Weeks turned into months, and the project took on a life of its own. The global pilot began rolling out, starting in Kenya and Peru, with translators and local educators adapting the platform to their communities in real time. What had started as a bold idea had now become something deeply human, fluid, collaborative, alive. Jacob was in the middle of it all, not as a boss, but as a bridge. The kind of leader who didn't dictate, but listened, who didn't walk ahead, but beside. He spent his mornings at the office, his afternoons in calls with teachers across the globe, and his evenings, always with Lila. Their lives were full of post-its, pancakes, and purpose. One night, while they were brushing their teeth, Lila leaned over the sink and said through a mouthful of foam, "I think you're a helper now." Jacob turned to her mid-rinse. "A helper? Yeah, like the people who fix big stuff that nobody sees is broken." He looked at her in the mirror and nodded. "That's the best job title I've ever had." Later that week, he flew to Mexico City to attend a community education summit. It was his first trip without Lila since they'd moved, and saying goodbye at the airport was harder than he expected. She hugged him with her whole little body, then slipped something into his coat pocket, a folded drawing of a rocket and a note. "Don't forget your mission." The summit was everything he hoped it would be. He met people who were building solutions out of nothing but chalkboards and hope. He listened to teachers whose classrooms had no windows but were filled with sunlight anyway. He shared what he'd learned, not the tech specs, but the lessons about empathy, about seeing every student as someone's entire universe. On the final day, he was invited to speak on stage. He stood behind the podium, nervous but steady, and said, "I used to think innovation was about intelligence, but now I know it's about compassion. The smartest solutions come from the deepest care. And the people closest to the problem, whether it's a kid in the back row or a single dad with a crumpled resume, They're often the ones holding the key. Afterward, a young teacher approached him in tears. She thanked him not for the platform, but for the reminder that her work mattered. Jacob shook her hand and said something that had become a quiet mantra. Never underestimate the ripple. You start just by showing up. Back home, things felt more grounded than ever. Jacob had learned to delegate, to breathe, to let the silence of success be enough. There were no more urgent scrambles or survival mode mornings. There was rhythm, grace. One Saturday morning, he and Lila walked to the local library. She had a mission of her own: donate her old books to the Little Readers section. As they walked, she reached up and grabbed his hand. "Did I help a little?" she asked. He looked down, smiling. "You helped a lot." They dropped off the books and walked to the park afterward. She drew constellations in a sandbox with a stick while Jacob sat on the bench, watching her the same way he had all those nights in their old apartment when he didn't know what tomorrow would bring. Except now, tomorrow was something he looked forward to. As the sun dipped low and golden over the trees, he felt his phone buzz with an email from Nadine. Yes, that Nadine. The subject line read, "Full circle moment." Inside was a forwarded message. "To whom it may concern, my name is Khalil Thompson. I'm a high school student in Oakland, and I'm applying for the Tech for Humanity Scholarship. I learned about this program through a project I was part of years ago, something that made school feel like home. I don't know if this note will reach him, but if it does, tell Mr. Renner I'm still chasing the stars. And I'm going to catch them this time. KT." Jacob stared at the screen, motionless, heart full. Then he closed the email, turned off his phone, and walked to Lila. She looked up, grinning, sand all over her jeans. "Ready for launch?" she asked. "Always," he said, scooping her into his arms and spinning her beneath the sky. It was a Friday afternoon when Jacob received the calendar invite marked only with the words, "Private, studio visit." The location was a nondescript building nestled between a shipping warehouse and a recycled materials center, easy to overlook unless you were looking carefully. Curious but unfazed, Jacob arrived early, greeted by a security badge scanner and a quiet assistant who led him down a hallway lined with abstract art and white noise. Inside, the space was unlike anything he'd seen in the rest of the company. A mixture of lab and library with tables covered in blueprints, 3D printed components, VR headsets, and clusters of engineers and artists in deep, focused conversation. At the center, as if pulled from the quiet eye of a creative storm, stood Elon. No suit, just a black t-shirt, jeans, and a look that said he'd been up all night thinking about something important. He turned as Jacob approached. "Glad you came." "Wasn't exactly sure what I was coming to," Jacob said, half grinning. Elon gestured to the space around them. "This is Era. We haven't announced it yet. It's what comes after the schools." Jacob's brow furrowed. "After?" Elon nodded. "The kids we've helped, they'll grow. The world will keep changing, and we need to think beyond education. Era is about life infrastructure, digital support ecosystems, emotional scaffolding. It's everything tech was supposed to become before it got distracted by profit margins." He motioned to a table where someone was demoing an empathy-based interface for teens dealing with grief and anxiety. Another screen played back visualizations of story-mapped learning journeys, literal data-drawn paths where creativity and well-being intersected with academic growth. Jacob was stunned. It was all so forward, yet rooted in something real. "So why am I here?" he asked, almost whispering. "Because the core of Era is trust. And no algorithm can build that," Elon replied. "We want you to help lead the human integration side. Not just strategy, not just ops, culture, meaning. We've got the architecture. We need the soul." Jacob stood silent, the weight of the offer sinking in slowly. It was bigger than anything he'd imagined. And yet somehow it felt natural, like every hard step had pointed him here. "I'll need time to think," he said finally, honestly. Elon smiled. "Good. If you didn't, you wouldn't be the right person." That night, Jacob walked home slowly. The streets of Oakland glowed under early spring light, shop fronts flickering on as the sun began to tuck itself behind the skyline. He passed a mural in progress near a community garden, kids painting handprints into a shape that looked a lot like a rising sun. At home, Lila was building a city out of cereal boxes and colored paper. This one's the library, and this is the park, and this is the wishing rocket. It only flies if you mean it. He sat beside her, watching as she carefully glued a paper tower upright. "Bug," he said softly, "what would you wish for if you had one wish?" She thought for a moment, tapping the tip of her marker to her chin. "I'd wish for people to feel more. Not cry feel. Just feel what other people are feeling. Then they wouldn't be mean or scared so much." Jacob smiled, pulling her into a side hug. "You just designed Era in 10 seconds. She giggled. "What's that?" "Something I'm thinking of helping build." "Will it have room for drawings?" "For yours?" "Always." Later that night, after she was asleep and the world had gone still, Jacob stood by the window. He looked out over the city and thought about legacy, not in the big, shiny, billionaire kind of way, but in the quiet kind. The kind that gets whispered across generations in classrooms, in kitchens, in safe moments where someone says, because of him, things are better. He opened his laptop, reread the proposal Elon had sent, then clicked reply. "Count me in. Let's build it right." Jacob. He hit send, closed the lid, and let out a long breath. Outside, the city pulsed on, but inside something shifted. A new door opened, and for the first time in his life, Jacob wasn't just walking through it, he was holding it open for others. The following weeks were a blur of ideas, sketches, deep dives, and late-night sessions. Jacob found himself in conversations he never imagined he'd be part of, sitting across from behavioral scientists, urban planners, child psychologists, even poets. Era was unlike anything he'd ever seen. Not a company, not just a platform. It was more like a living question. What kind of world are we building, and for whom? Jacob's role evolved into something hybrid, part cultural strategist, part narrative architect. His desk, tucked near a row of indoor plants and a giant corkboard wall, was covered in sticky notes with phrases like, "See the invisible," designed for silence, and "What does safe look like for a 10-year-old in Lagos?" He led a team of 12, not by hierarchy, but by invitation. Every Monday, they began with one question: who are we forgetting? That question alone shaped the blueprint of Era. One afternoon, as a storm rolled across the bay, Jacob sat down for a video call with Khalil, now a scholarship finalist and an intern with the Oakland Tech Mentorship Program. His screen flickered for a moment, then the teen's face appeared, now taller, more confident, a little stubble peeking through. "Mr. Renner." Khalil beamed. Jacob smiled. "Just Jacob, man. I keep telling you." "I know," Khalil said, "but old habits." They talked about Khalil's senior project, a learning tool that combined rhythm and math to help kids who struggled with number retention. "Beats before digits," he called it. Jacob was impressed. "You're on to something," Jacob said. "It's not about dumbing things down. It's about meeting people where they are." "That's what you always did," Khalil said. "Back then, you didn't make me feel broken. You made me feel like I was already smart." Jacob paused. That sentence hit somewhere deep. "Well," he said finally, "I just saw what was already there." After the call, Jacob walked into one of the focus pods near the corner windows and sat down with his notebook. The storm was breaking, sunlight slicing through gray clouds like hope sneaking back into the room. He flipped to a fresh page and wrote, "Empathy isn't a feature, it's the frame." Across the office, a small team of interns was laughing around a whiteboard. One of them was drawing an interface mock-up shaped like a playground instead of a dashboard. Another had added a button that said, "Ask how they're feeling, not just how they're doing." Jacob felt something rise in his chest. It wasn't pride, it was recognition. They were getting it. The message was carrying forward without him needing to push it. That night, Jacob and Lila watched the stars from the fire escape of their apartment. She had a blanket wrapped around her like a cape and a cup of chocolate milk resting beside her knee. They looked up at the same sky they always had, but now it felt closer somehow. "Do you think the stars talk to each other?" she asked. "Maybe," Jacob said. "Maybe they tell stories." "What kind of stories?" "Stories about people who kept going, even when no one believed in them. Stories about little girls who changed the world with art and bravery and big questions." Lila smiled. "I think they'd like those stories." "I think so too." She leaned her head on his shoulder, and they sat there quietly as the city pulsed below them and the stars blinked above, an infinite loop of light and waiting. Jacob's phone buzzed once, a message from Elon. "We're going to pilot Era with UNICEF." They said yes. "Get ready." He stared at the words, then turned off the screen. Not because it wasn't important, but because for now, the most important thing was the girl beside him and the stars above her. And that, more than any project or platform, was the future worth protecting. The partnership with UNICEF moved fast. Within 6 weeks, Era was being prepped for deployment across 3 pilot countries, Ecuador, Nepal, and Senegal. Jacob worked tirelessly, not just with developers and UX designers, but with local leaders, school principals, community elders, and youth advocates. He quickly learned that listening across cultures wasn't about translation. It was about humility. He had video calls at 2 a.m. to accommodate time zones. He walked through rough paper sketches with teachers in Kathmandu who had never used a tablet. He sat silently for 20 minutes with a grandmother in Dakar before she finally told him the one thing she needed from any program: don't let it erase our stories. That hit him hard, because it was exactly what he was trying to prevent. Back in Oakland, Jacob and Lila kept their rituals going, no matter how hectic things became. Pancake Saturdays, walks to the library, evening art time on the living room floor, surrounded by markers and half-folded construction paper. One night, while they sat cross-legged making storybooks, Lila looked up and asked, "Can I come with you next time?" "To where, Bug?" "To one of the places with the kids, where you're helping." Jacob hesitated. "It's not all fun, sweetie. It's lots of work. Long flights." She stared at him. "But it matters, right?" He smiled. "Yeah, it really does." "Then I want to see it." And that's how, after many emails, signatures, and triple checks, Lila accompanied him on a short trip to Ecuador, a small community outside of Cuenca, where Era's beta version was being implemented at a local learning center. The moment they arrived, Lila was swarmed by local kids. Language didn't matter. They made friends instantly through drawings and laughter. Jacob stood back and watched her kneel beside a little girl named Sophia, teaching her to color within the lines of a starlight rocket they'd traced together. He realized then that Lila wasn't just witnessing the mission. She was part of it. The center director, a man named Tomas, approached Jacob later that day. "Your daughter," he said in a thick accent, "is like light. You see her, and it makes everything brighter." Jacob nodded, heart full. That's her superpower. They toured the site together. Feedback from students was posted on a large board in the hallway, covered in sticky notes in Spanish and Quechua. One stood out, written in shaky handwriting from a boy who'd struggled in school for years. "This is the first time something spoke to me. Not just at me." Jacob took a photo. That night, in the quiet of their homestay, Lila looked out the window at the stars while brushing her teeth. "I think the stars here are louder," she said through the bubbles. "Maybe we're just quieter," Jacob replied. Back home, things only accelerated. The UNICEF announcement went public. Media outlets started circling. Jacob, always camera shy, found himself in interviews on podcasts, quoted in articles, even invited to speak at the UN Tech for Equity Summit in Geneva. He turned down most offers, not out of arrogance but clarity. "This isn't about me," he said in one email. "It's about the voices that never got a platform. Let's keep it that way." Elon respected that. In fact, he admired it. In one late-night message exchange, Elon wrote, "Funny, the guy who once handed me a wrinkled resume is now influencing global education frameworks." Jacob responded, "Guess that means gas stations should start screening for philosophers." Elon replied with a simple laughing emoji. And while the world noticed what Era was doing, Jacob stayed focused on the only metric that mattered: impact. Fewer kids dropping out, more students smiling in class, communities choosing to share stories instead of losing them, families sitting down together to explore, learn, and listen. And through it all, he made sure of one thing: that nothing about Era made children feel less human, only more. Jacob sat in the back of the auditorium, fingers lightly tapping his knee, as the Tech for Equity Summit in Geneva began to fill with educators, policymakers, and visionaries from over 30 countries. He wasn't here to speak, not yet. He'd initially declined the invitation, uncomfortable with the spotlight. But when UNICEF asked him to co-host a closed-door session with their global education leads, he knew it wasn't about attention. It was about alignment. So he flew in quietly. No entourage, just his backpack, a folder of notes, and a photo of Lila tucked in the front sleeve. The session went longer than expected. Conversations unraveled into meaningful threads about data bias, access inequity, language barriers, emotional intelligence, and the need to center children not as passive recipients of content, but as active co-creators of their future. Jacob listened more than he spoke, but when he did speak, people leaned in. At one point, a delegate from Bangladesh asked him, "What's the one lesson you'd want every child to learn?" Jacob thought for a moment, then said that their worth doesn't depend on how well they perform, but how deeply they connect with themselves and with others. Silence filled the room, the kind that lets you know someone just said something you'll remember. Later that evening, Jacob took a long walk along Lake Geneva. The water was still, catching the colors of the evening sky like glass. He called Lila, who answered from her bed, already in pajamas, with marker ink on her cheek and hair sticking out in 3 directions. "Did you talk to the bedroom people?" she asked. "I did," Jacob said. "Did you tell them about me?" "Only a little. I told them about kids like you." She grinned. "Did they listen?" "I think they did." He paused, watching the soft lights of the boats drift. "I miss you." "I miss you too," she said. "But it's okay. I made you something." "What is it?" "You'll see when you get home. It's in your pillow." He chuckled. "You hid something in my pillow." "Not your pillow. The one on my side." "Duh." He smiled. "Then I'll check it the second I get home." The next day, after a brief panel wrap-up and thank yous, Jacob boarded his flight back to California. The sky outside the plane was endless blue, layered in clouds like soft shelves. He watched it drift by, thinking about how far he'd come, not just in miles, but in meaning. Back home that evening, he dropped his bag by the door and made a beeline for Lila's room. She was asleep, one arm flopped off the bed, hugging a rocket-shaped pillow. Carefully, he lifted the corner of her actual pillow and found a folded paper tucked beneath. A drawing of a father holding hands with his daughter, standing in front of a globe, surrounded by tiny, smiling faces. Above them, written in glittery marker, were the words, "My daddy helps the world feel safe." Jacob sat on the edge of her bed, the drawing shaking slightly in his hand. No award, no applause, nothing ever printed in a report could match this. The next day, back at the Era studio, he walked into the morning meeting and pinned the drawing to the big corkboard by the coffee station. A few engineers paused to look at it. Someone whispered, "That's beautiful." He just nodded. That same afternoon, a soft ping announced a message from Elon. "I think it's time we go further. Era is working. Let's make it open source." Jacob reread it twice, then typed, "Yes, let's let the world build with us." And just like that, the mission expanded again. Not for profit, not for PR, but because the stars are brighter when everyone gets to look up and feel like they belong to the sky. In the weeks following the open source announcement, something remarkable happened. Schools, nonprofits, educators, and even independent developers around the world began adopting Era's core framework. From a refugee learning center in northern Jordan to a rural township in South Africa, the platform was no longer just a product, it was a shared language. Jacob watched it unfold from the Oakland studio, his desk surrounded by pinned-up letters, screenshots of thank you messages, and hand-drawn maps where children had marked their favorite parts of Era. He tried not to get swept up in the scale of it. He focused instead on what he always had, the small moments that mattered. One day, an envelope arrived with no return address, just international postage and a faint blue stamp. Inside was a photograph. A group of children sitting in a semicircle beneath a tree in Ghana, tablets on their laps, with a teacher kneeling beside them. At the bottom of the photo, someone had written, "The tree is our school. The light is our hope. Era is our bridge." Jacob read the words again and again, not because he didn't believe them, but because he did. That evening, he took Lila out for their favorite walk by the marina. The breeze was light, and the sky was painted in streaks of lavender and apricot. As they walked, she skipped a few steps ahead, and then stopped. "I have a question." "Shoot." "If everyone has Era now, does that mean your job is done?" Jacob smiled. "Not even close." "Why not?" "Because helping isn't a job you finish. It's a way you live." She mulled that over, then nodded, satisfied. Back home, as they folded laundry together, she pulled one of her drawings from her backpack and handed it to him. "This one's for the next wall at your office." It was a rocket again, but this one had dozens of tiny windows, and inside each window was a different face, all smiling, all connected by a bright line that ran through the ship like a thread. At the top, she'd written, "No one flies alone." Jacob didn't even try to hold back the tears. Later that week, at the weekly studio meeting, Jacob stood up and quietly placed the drawing beside the others. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The team gathered around it, and for a moment, the clatter of keyboards and coffee cups faded, replaced by something softer. A stillness that carried weight. Then Keenan turned and said, "Yo, we should build this into the onboarding. A wall of why." Priya added, "We could call it the anchor wall." Jacob just nodded. "Make sure there's room for 1,000 windows." And so it became tradition. Anyone who joined Era, whether in the Oakland studio or the new hubs sprouting up in Manila, Nairobi, or Sao Paulo, added their own window to the wall. A sketch, a sentence, a reason. Jacob's reason never changed. One line, written in Sharpie across the bottom left corner of the corkboard. "Because one day, a stranger didn't walk past me." And even though it wasn't signed, everyone knew who wrote it. Elon visited the studio again near the end of that month. He didn't say much, just walked around slowly, taking in what the project had become. When he reached the wall, he stopped and stared. After a long moment, he turned to Jacob. "You ever think about what would have happened if I hadn't taken your resume?" Jacob shook his head. "I think about what would have happened if I hadn't offered it." Elon smiled faintly. "Right answer." They stood there in silence, two men who had lived vastly different lives, but who had somehow met in the middle of something greater than either of them could have imagined. And outside, the sun rose a little higher over a world just a bit more connected. By the day the open source Era platform officially surpassed 1 million active users, Jacob didn't spend it in meetings or interviews. He spent it sitting in a sunlit corner of a small neighborhood cafe with Lila, 2 mugs of cocoa in front of them, and a deck of homemade flashcards she'd created to teach him space explorer vocabulary. Across the globe, communities were gathering to celebrate the milestone, some with live streams, others with murals, others with candlelit circles where students shared how their lives had changed. But Jacob, always rooted in the smallest moments, chose stillness. Chose this. "This one means friend who understands feelings," Lila explained, holding up a card with a squiggly alien and a heart drawn in the center of its chest. Jacob smiled. "That's probably the most important kind of explorer." As she shuffled the cards, he checked his phone, just once. A new message from Nadine. "News just broke. Press is everywhere. The UN called. Elon's going on CNN tonight." His only quote, "We owe the future to a man who handed me a wrinkled resume at a gas station." Jacob chuckled softly and slid the phone back into his pocket. "You okay, Daddy?" Lila asked. "Yeah," he said, "just remembering." Later that night, back home, they curled up on the couch and watched the global live stream highlight reel. Kids dancing in rural schools, teachers crying, volunteers in crowded community halls hugging one another. A montage of clips cut together with quiet music, faces of all colors, voices speaking in dozens of languages, each saying the same name, Era. And at the end, a single quote filled the screen. Technology alone can't change the world, but people with open hearts, given the right tools, absolutely can. Jacob Renner. Lila gasped, "That's you." Jacob smiled, eyes glassy. "That's us." In the weeks that followed, the story spread. The gas station moment became legend. But Jacob didn't capitalize on it. He didn't sign a book deal. He didn't start a company. He just kept showing up at the studio, kept listening, kept helping, because that's what this had always been about. Years later, a new team member, fresh out of college, asked him, "What made you really hand that resume to Elon? Weren't you scared he'd just ignore you?" Jacob looked at the kid and said, "Of course I was scared, but I was more afraid of Lila growing up and thinking I'd stop trying." That answer became an anchor story, one people shared in orientations, classrooms, podcasts, not because it was extraordinary, but because it was relatable. Because everyone at some point is standing in front of a door they're not sure they're allowed to knock on. One quiet afternoon, long after Era had become a movement, not just a platform, Jacob sat in the garden outside his home, watching Lila, now a teenager, paint the sky in vibrant watercolors. She looked up and asked, "Do you ever wonder how things would have gone if you never stopped at that gas station?" He nodded. "All the time." "And do you think you'd still be helping people?" "I hope so," he said, "but I think I might still be waiting for permission." She dipped her brush into orange and whispered, "I'm glad you didn't wait." He looked out over the garden, sunlight shimmering through the trees, the world quiet, hopeful, alive. And then, with the gentlest breath of truth, he said, "Me too." Thank you for watching. If this story moved you even a little, let us know where you're watching from in the comments, your city, your town, your corner of the world. And tell us, what's your version of the gas station moment? The moment you didn't walk away. The moment you offered something, even when it felt impossible. Let's fill the comments with those stories, because we all have one, and someone might be waiting to hear yours.